Imagine a massive 59-story skyscraper in the heart of Manhattan. It is a shining silver monument to corporate power, a futuristic design that looks like it belongs in a science fiction movie. Now imagine a young engineering student sitting in a university library, hundreds of miles away, doing some simple math on a napkin and realizing that this billion-dollar tower is fundamentally broken. They realize that in a strong wind, the building won't just sway. The entire structure will fail, toppling over like a giant tree and crushing blocks of the most densely populated city on Earth. This sounds like the plot of a thriller, but in 1978, this was the terrifying reality for the Citicorp Center in New York. While the city went about its business, unaware of the catastrophe looming overhead, a small group of engineers worked through the night in total secrecy to weld the building back together before the next hurricane hit. This is the story of the greatest engineering disaster that never happened, and the massive cover-up that kept it hidden for nearly 20 years. To understand why the Citicorp Center was so dangerous, we have to look at the bizarre way it was built. In the early 1970s, Citicorp wanted to build a massive headquarters in Midtown Manhattan, but there was a problem. One corner of the plot of land was occupied by St. Peter's Lutheran Church. The church agreed to let the skyscraper be built, but only if the new building didn't touch the church. They wanted their sacred space to remain open and airy. Most developers would have walked away, but Citicorp's engineer, a man named William Lemessurier, had a wild idea. He decided to put the entire building on stilts. Instead of putting the support columns at the corners of the building like every other skyscraper in history, he moved the columns to the center of each of the four sides. This allowed the corners of the building to hang out over the church like a giant cantilever. It was an architectural marvel, but it created a structural nightmare. Because the building was standing on these massive stilts, it was incredibly top-heavy. To keep it from twisting and swaying too much, Lemessurier used a system of giant V-shaped braces inside the walls. These braces were designed to take the massive weight of the building and funnel it down into those four central pillars. On paper, it was perfect. The building was completed in 1977, and it immediately became an icon of the New York skyline with its unique slanted roof. But then in 1978, a student named Diane Hartley started looking at the design for her thesis. She noticed something that Lemessurier had seemingly overlooked. In traditional engineering, you calculate the wind hitting a building straight on, what we call perpendicular winds. But Hartley realized that for a building on stilts with V-braces, the real danger came from quartering winds, winds that hit the building at a 45-degree angle, striking the corners. When she reached out to Lemessurier's office with her concerns, the veteran engineer initially brushed her off. But eventually, he decided to double-check his math. What he found sent a chill down his spine. Hartley was right. When wind hit the building diagonally, it increased the strain on the V-braces by 40%. That in itself was a problem. But it wasn't the catastrophe. The catastrophe came when he looked at how those braces were actually held together. In his original design, the braces were supposed to be welded. Welding creates a bond as strong as the steel itself. But during construction, the builders had changed the plans from welds to bolts to save money. This happened without Lemessurier realizing the full implications. Bolts are significantly weaker than welds. When he ran the numbers with the bolted joints and the diagonal wind loads, he realized the building had a critical failure point. If a storm with 70-mile-per-hour winds hit New York City, the bolts would shear off, the braces would snap, and the tower would fall. Statistically, a storm of that magnitude hits New York every 16 years. Lemessurier was looking at a building that was essentially a ticking clock. He didn't just have an engineering problem. He had a moral crisis. If he told the public, there would be a mass panic. Citicorp would be bankrupt. His career would be over. But if he stayed silent and a hurricane hit, thousands of people could be in danger. In a move that is now studied in ethics classes around the world, Lemessurier chose to tell the truth, but with a twist. He went to the executives at Citicorp and explained the situation. They made a radical decision. They were going to fix the building, but they were going to do it in total secrecy to avoid a citywide evacuation. The plan was audacious. They hired a team of welders to come into the building every night after the office workers went home. From 8 in the evening until 4 in the morning, these crews would peel back the drywall and the insulation to expose the bolted joints of the V-braces. They would then weld massive steel plates over the bolts, essentially reinforcing the entire skeleton of the tower while the city slept. To keep the secret, They told the public that they were simply working on a new fire safety system. They even had a cover story for the heavy equipment and the noise. But the danger was far from over. As the welders were working, a hurricane began to form in the Atlantic. Hurricane Ella was heading straight for New York. This is where the story gets truly intense. While the welders were rushing to finish the joints, the city started preparing for a disaster they didn't fully understand. Citicorp and the city officials actually drafted evacuation plans for the surrounding 10-block radius. They had the Red Cross on standby. They had a weather station installed on top of the building to monitor wind speeds in real time. If the winds hit a certain threshold, they were going to pull the alarm and start clearing out thousands of people. Imagine the stress of these engineers watching the weather reports every hour, knowing that their secret fix might not be finished in time. They were literally racing against a hurricane to save the most famous city in the world. Fortunately, at the very last minute, Hurricane Ella turned out to sea. The winds never reached the danger zone, and the weather stayed calm long enough for the welders to finish the job. After several months of nocturnal labor, the Citicorp Center was finally as strong as it was always supposed to be. The welds were complete, the braces were reinforced, and the building was now one of the safest in the city. And here is the craziest part. They didn't tell anyone. For nearly 20 years, the story of the Citicorp collapse risk was a tightly held secret. It wasn't until 1995, when a journalist for The New Yorker broke the story, that the public found out just how close they had come to a disaster. Why does this matter so much for those of us interested in megaprojects and engineering? It highlights the terrifying reality of innovation risk. When we push the boundaries of what is possible, we often outpace our own understanding of the risks involved. The Citicorp Center was a victim of its own brilliance. Because it was so unique, the standard rules of engineering didn't quite apply, and it took a fresh pair of eyes from a student to see the hole in the logic. It also shows the disconnect between the design and the build. The switch from welds to bolts was a small cost-saving measure on the ground, but in the context of the whole system, it was a flaw that could have brought the whole thing down. This secrecy also raises massive ethical questions. Was Citicorp right to keep it a secret? By avoiding a panic, they prevented the chaos that an evacuation would have caused. But they also deprived the people living and working in that area of the right to know the risk they were taking. It's a classic dilemma of utilitarianism, doing the greatest good for the greatest number. In this case, the gamble paid off. But if Hurricane Ella had hit, the secret would have gone down in history as one of the most negligent cover-ups in human history. Let's talk about the tuned mass damper because it plays a huge role in this story. The Citicorp Center was the first skyscraper to use one of these devices. It's essentially a 400-ton block of concrete on the top floor that sits on a film of oil and is controlled by computers. When the building sways one way, the block moves the other way to stabilize it. During the 1978 crisis, the engineers realized that if the power went out during a storm, the damper would stop working and the building would be even more likely to collapse. They had to frantically install a dedicated generator just for that concrete block. It shows how complex these buildings really are. You aren't just building a tower, you're building a machine, and every part of that machine has to work perfectly together. When we look back at the 1970s, it was an era of radical change for New York's skyline. Architects were trying to break away from the boxy look of the 50s and 60s. They wanted flair. They wanted drama. The slanted roof of the Citicorp Center was designed to hold solar panels, which was incredibly ahead of its time, though they never actually installed them because the angle was wrong. This obsession with style over substance is a recurring theme in failing megaprojects. When the aesthetic vision overpowers the engineering reality, you get problems. In the case of Citicorp, they got lucky. In the case of other buildings we've looked at, like 432 Park, the problems are constant and ongoing. What is fascinating is how William Le Messurier's reputation actually improved after the secret came out. Instead of being shamed for his mistake, he was celebrated for his honesty and his quick action to fix the problem. He became a hero in the engineering community for being willing to admit he was wrong and spending the money and effort to make it right. It's a lesson that many modern developers could learn from. In a world of lawsuits and finger-pointing, taking responsibility is the most powerful thing you can do. The secret repairs also had a physical effect on the building that you can still see today if you know where to look. The interior walls that were torn down and replaced aren't original. The whole internal skeleton of the building is a patchwork of the original 1970s construction and the emergency 1978 reinforcements. It is a building with two histories, one that is visible to everyone, and one that happened in the dark, under the cover of flashlights and welding sparks. Think about the welders for a moment. These men were the unsung heroes of New York. They were working in cramped, hot conditions high up in a building that they knew might fall over if the wind blew too hard. They weren't just doing a job. They were performing a surgical operation on a giant. They had to be precise, they had to be fast, and they had to be quiet. If the news had leaked, their work would have been stopped immediately by the city's building inspectors. They were working in a legal limbo, between a disaster and a solution. The student, Diane Hartley, didn't even know for years that her phone call had triggered such a massive event. She had made her observations, called the office, and then gone on with her life, assuming the professionals had handled it. It wasn't until she saw the news story decades later that she realized she was the one who had saved the building. It's a powerful reminder that an outsider's perspective can often find the flaws that experts have become blind to. When you are too close to a project, you see what you expect to see. You see the math working because you want it to work. It takes someone who doesn't have a stake in the project to ask the dumb question that changes everything. Even today, the Citicorp Center, now known as 601 Lexington Avenue, is a marvel. But it's a marvel with a shadow. It reminds us that our cities are built on trust. We trust that the buildings we walk under won't fall down. We trust that the bridges we drive over are safe. We trust that the engineers have done the math. But the 1978 crisis shows that trust is a fragile thing. Sometimes the math is wrong. Sometimes the builders take shortcuts. And sometimes the only thing standing between a normal Tuesday and a catastrophic failure is a student's thesis and a team of welders working through the night. The secrecy of the fix also protected the real estate market. If it had been known that one of the city's premier office buildings was at risk of falling, property values in all of Midtown would have plummeted. Businesses would have fled. The economic impact would have been just as bad as the physical impact. This is often why these mega projects are shrouded in mystery when things go wrong. The money involved is so large that the truth becomes a secondary concern to the financial stability of the project. We see this today in the tilting towers of San Francisco or the sinking towers of London. The first instinct is always to hide the problem, then to minimize it, and only as a last resort to fix it. We have to ask, how many other secrets are currently being held in the skylines of our major cities? With the rise of these ultra-thin pencil towers and experimental materials, are there other engineers working through the night to fix mistakes we won't hear about for another 20 years? The Citicorp story is a reminder to always be curious about the built environment around us. Every building has a story, and sometimes that story is much more dramatic than the lobby's marble flooring might suggest. As you look up at the slanted roof of the Citicorp building next time you are in New York, don't just see a skyscraper. See the what if. See the hurricane that didn't hit. See the bolts that were too weak and the welds that saved the day. The building is a testament to human error, but more importantly, it is a testament to human correction. We are imperfect builders, but we have the capacity to recognize our mistakes and fix them, even if we have to do it in the dark. The city is a living thing, and like any living thing, it has its scars and its secrets. The Citicorp Center is one of the biggest secrets of them all, a giant on stilts that once teetered on the edge of the unthinkable and lived to tell the tale. The legacy of the Citicorp crisis changed engineering education forever. It is now a mandatory case study in professional ethics and structural dynamics. It taught a whole generation of engineers that they are not just responsible to their clients or their bosses, but to the public at large. It reinforced the idea that redundancy in design is not a luxury, it is a necessity. If the building had been designed with a little more common sense and a little less stylistic flair, the bold change might not have been a catastrophe. But because the building was already on the edge of what was physically possible, it had no margin for error. In the world of mega projects, margin for error is the most important concept. When we build things that are just barely strong enough, we are inviting disaster. 432 Park, which we've discussed before, suffers from a similar lack of margin. It's so thin and so tall that every vibration is a problem. Citicorp was the same way. It was a perfect design that couldn't handle an imperfect world. And that is the ultimate takeaway for anyone interested in failing projects. The best engineering isn't the one that is the most clever or the most beautiful. It's the one that is the most resilient. It's the one that can survive a mistake. The story of the secret fix also reminds us of the power of the press. If that journalist hadn't dug into the story in 1995, we would likely still be in the dark. We would never have known about Diane Hartley or the Midnight Welders. Information is the only thing that keeps mega projects honest. As long as projects are allowed to happen in secret, the risk of failure increases. Sunlight is the best disinfectant for a culture of shortcuts and cover-ups. As we close this chapter on the Citicorp Center, take a moment to appreciate the sheer luck involved. A turn in the wind, a student's curiosity, an engineer's conscience. If any one of those things hadn't happened, the New York we know today would be a very different place. The skyscraper that nearly collapsed is more than just an office building. It's a landmark of how close we come to disaster and how we find our way back. It's a story of a silent city and a secret repair that reminds us that beneath the glass and the lights, the real world is held together by the skill and the integrity of the people who build it. Keep an eye on these giants in the sky. They are more fragile than they look, and their history is often more complex than we are told. The Citicorp Center stands tall today, a beautiful and stable part of the Manhattan skyline, but it carries the history of those long nights in 1978 in every welded joint. It is a building that was saved by the very people who built it, and in doing so, they saved more than just a piece of real estate. They saved the trust of a city. The secret is out, but the lesson remains. Engineering is a heavy responsibility, and the weight of a 59-story building is nothing compared to the weight of the truth. When you combine those two, you get one of the most incredible stories ever hidden in plain sight. Keep looking up, keep asking questions, and never assume that a building is as solid as it seems. There is always more to the story, especially when it comes to the failing and then rising mega projects of the world's greatest cities.